The fire crackled in the frozen stillness of the Alaskan forest, its orange glow casting restless shadows against the towering pines. Elliot sat near the flames, his breath clouding the air in pale wisps that rose and vanished in the night. He was 16, pale-skinned with soft brown hair falling into his eyes, a boy who had spent his life trying to earn a father's love that never seemed to exist. He had lost his mother years ago, and with her went the only person who had ever looked at him without judgment. What remained was a house filled with silence, and a father whose gaze carried more weight than words, always heavy, always disappointed. This trip, he thought, was supposed to be different. His father had promised the wilderness would be their chance to rebuild, a chance to find some common ground after years of distance. The words had sounded almost sincere. Eliot wanted to believe them. He had packed his worn jacket carefully, tucked a rainbow pin into the inside pocket, a small token of himself, hidden from the world but always close to his heart. For him, this was not just a camping trip. It was a fragile hope that perhaps love could replace the shame that clung to him. The fire was beginning to fade when his father moved suddenly. He unzipped the tent and pulled out the bags, one by one tossing them into the darkness beyond the fire's reach. Food, water, even the GPS, all hurled with cold precision. Eliot froze, confusion rising like a storm inside him. Then came the words that pierced deeper than the cold night air. Take care of yourself. I don't need a son like you. Maybe you'll meet a grizzly out here. The sound of those words was louder than the snap of burning wood. They burned through Eliot's chest, leaving him hollow. For a moment, he thought he had misheard, but the look in his father's eyes confirmed the truth. This was no accident. This was not carelessness. This was the plan. The forest suddenly felt infinite. Every shadow stretched longer, every sound sharper. The truth was unbearable. His father had brought him here not to heal, but to leave him behind, to erase him. His knees weakened as he watched the last of the supplies land in the dirt. A part of him still wanted to cry out, to beg for mercy, but another part knew it would be useless. This was the end of a bond that had already been dying, now severed with cruel finality. Eliot's throat tightened as he held back tears, his heart pounding not just with fear of the wilderness, but with the devastation of knowing he had been marked unworthy simply for being who he was. The boy who had once imagined sharing laughter by the fire now stood before betrayal so deep it cut into his very sense of belonging. The wind whispered through the branches as if mocking the silence between them. Eliot felt the cold seeping into his bones, heavier with every passing second. He knew the forest was not forgiving. Without food, without tools, without direction, survival was unlikely. The thought of wandering aimlessly until hunger or a predator claimed him was no longer abstract. It was the reality placed upon him by the one person who was meant to protect him. He looked at the flames one last time, their warmth already shrinking. His father turned away, the outline of his body vanishing into the dark like a man discarding an object. Not a child. In that moment, Eliot realized something more painful than death itself. He was not abandoned by accident, but condemned by choice. The tears finally came, hot against the icy air. He let them fall silently, no one there to see or comfort him. In his pocket, his fingers found the small rainbow pin, the only piece of himself he dared to keep visible. He pressed it into his palm until it hurt. A quiet reminder that though his father could cast him aside, there was still something in him worth holding on to. The forest groaned around him. Somewhere in the distance, the guttural growl of a bear echoed, followed by the haunting cry of a wolf. Eliot shut his eyes for a brief moment, clutching the pin, whispering only to himself, "I will not break. Not tonight." The fire dimmed further, sparks lifting into the sky like fragments of a dying hope. Yet in the ashes of betrayal, something stronger stirred. Eliot had been thrown into the cold with nothing but despair alone would not decide his fate. This was where his story shifted. He had been left to perish. But within the silence of the night came the unspoken promise that he would endure, not to prove his father wrong, but to prove to himself that his existence mattered. Sometimes the harshest cruelty reveals the depth of one's strength. Eliot did not yet know what awaited him beyond the shadows. But the boy who sat trembling at the edge of the campfire was no longer the same. He was already beginning to transform, one breath of icy air at a time. If this story has gripped you from the beginning, subscribe to Heart Story and stay with us as we follow Elliott's journey through the darkness of betrayal into the light of survival. Because sometimes the cruelest abandonment becomes the birthplace of unshakable resilience. The night did not end with the betrayal by the fire. When the last spark sank into the darkness, Eliot was left with nothing but the weight of his own breath and the endless reach of the Alaskan wilderness. The ground beneath him was frozen. The branches above swayed with a haunting rhythm, and every whisper of the wind carried the threat of something approaching. Panic surged first, quick and uncontrollable. His chest tightening as he realized he had no food, no tools, no guide through the labyrinth of trees. He wanted to scream, but the forest would only echo it back, indifferent. He stumbled away from the camp, the ashes of the fire cooling behind him, unsure of where his feet were taking him. The instinct to run pressed hard, but the cold reminded him of its merciless power. Running blindly meant falling faster, so he forced himself to breathe, to recall fragments of knowledge he had gathered on nights alone, when books and videos were his companions. While other boys learned from fathers or scouts, Eliot had studied survival because it fascinated him, because deep down he knew he could never rely on anyone else to teach him. Now those hours spent with dog-eared pages and glowing screens were no longer hobbies, they were lifelines. He searched for water first, because he remembered the rule that it meant direction, meant life. His ears strained through the night until faintly he heard the gurgle of a stream. Following it through thick brush, he dropped to his knees and drank with cupped hands, the icy water stinging his throat, yet clearing his mind. The stream gave him more than water. It gave him orientation. People always said water led to valleys, and valleys could lead to people. That thought gave him something to hold on to. When exhaustion pressed him to the ground, he scavenged branches and leaves, awkwardly building a small shelter against the trunk of a fir tree. It was no more than a fragile lean-to, but it shielded him from the sharpest teeth of the wind. His stomach cramped from hunger, but he remembered how to identify certain roots and berries he had seen in books. With trembling fingers, he pulled at thin strands of wild roots, bitter when he bit into them, and searched for dark berries he recognized from illustrations. They were tart, not sweet, but they were enough to keep his body moving. The forest came alive in the silence of night. A wolf's cry broke through the distance, low and mournful. The scrape of claws against bark told him a bear was near, circling some tree in search of food. Every sound pressed closer, and Eliot pressed the rainbow pin harder against his jacket. He had pulled it from his pocket, letting its faint reflection catch the moonlight. In the midst of fear, it was his secret beacon, a reminder that even in the wilderness, his identity was not something to discard. It was his fire, small but unyielding. Tears came again, though softer than before, flowing not from panic but from the quiet pain of isolation. He whispered to himself, the words no louder than the rustle of pine needles. I will live. I will live so he cannot erase me. The statement was not only defiance against his father, but also a fragile promise to the boy inside who still longed to be loved. The hours passed slowly, each one stretched by hunger and the fear that something larger, something merciless, might break through the trees. Still, Eliot endured. When morning came, his body was stiff from cold, his lips cracked, but he had survived the first trial. He had done it alone, guided by scraps of knowledge he had once thought useless. The forest had tried to claim him, but it had not succeeded. In that fragile dawn, Eliot realized survival was not just about keeping his body alive. It was about keeping his spirit intact. The pin pressed against his chest was not simply decoration. It was his resistance. In the shadows of a world that rejected him, he had chosen to remain visible to himself. And in that act of choosing, a lesson formed as natural as the rising sun, even when abandoned by those who should protect you. The strength to endure is still yours to claim. It does not come from their acceptance, but from the quiet decision to keep walking, to keep breathing, to keep believing that your existence holds worth no one else can take. The sun broke through the tree line in pale fragments, cold light spilling across the moss and stone. Eliot's body trembled with exhaustion as he dragged himself along the bank of the stream. His legs no longer obeyed him fully. Every step was an argument with gravity. The bitter roots he had chewed through the night did little more than settle his hunger into a dull ache. His throat burned with thirst despite the water he drank, and the cold gnawed deeper into his bones. He pushed forward until his vision blurred, the stream rippling and bending as though the world itself tilted beneath him. Kneeling to drink again, his knees buckled, and he collapsed against the icy mud. The water that had once given him clarity now reflected only the fragility of a boy whose strength had run thin. Eliot pressed his cheek against the earth, his hand clutching the rainbow pin so tightly it left marks in his palm. His breath came shallow, uneven, and for the first time, he wondered if this was the last moment though he would ever see the morning. Then came a sound that did not belong to the wilderness, the steady growl of an engine. It cut through the forest like a lifeline. Tires crunched against gravel, and the hum grew louder until it became the unmistakable echo of an ATV weaving between the trees. Eliot tried to lift his head, but his body resisted, sinking deeper into fatigue. The machine stopped, and voices young, startled, rose above the murmur of water. Over here, one called, urgent and sharp. Feet pounded the earth, drawing close. Then strong arms lifted Eliot carefully, cradling him as though he might break. A man's voice spoke with steady calm, a tone hardened by discipline, yet softened by care. It belonged to Mr. Carter, a retired soldier and now guardian to the group of scouts who had come exploring these woods. His weathered face carried lines carved by experience, but his eyes were gentle as they studied the boy in his arms. "This isn't an accident," Carter muttered under his breath, noticing the absence of gear. The way Eliot's clothes bore no signs of careless wandering but of deliberate abandonment. He wrapped a thermal blanket around the boy, barking quiet orders to the scouts who followed his lead. "Get the pack. Call it in. We move fast." Eliot stirred, his lips parting to form words, though they broke with weakness. He tried to hide the pin still clutched in his hand, as though revealing it would invite more rejection. Carter noticed. Instead of prying it away, he placed his gloved hand gently over Eliot's and said quietly, so only the boy could hear, "Don't be afraid. I know what it means to be cast aside for who you are, but you're safe now." The assurance was more powerful than the blanket warming his skin. For the first time since the campfire, Eliot felt seen not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as someone worth protecting. Carter lifted him onto the ATV, and with the scouts surrounding them like a shield, they sped toward the ranger station that stood miles away. The forest rushed past in a blur of green and white, its dangers fading behind them with every mile. Inside, Eliot's chest swelled with something unfamiliar, the fragile beginning of trust. The man who carried him was not bound by blood, but by choice. That choice carried weight. It meant survival was no longer a lonely battle fought in silence. At the ranger station, warmth and medicine would restore to Eliot's body. Yet what revived his spirit was the moment Carter spoke those words, words born of lived truth. They carried the lesson Eliot had been denied at home. Family is not always given by birth. Sometimes it is found in those who have survived the same wounds and choose to stand beside you when the world tries to erase you. The ranger station smelled of pine wood and antiseptic, a place where the wilderness stopped at the threshold. Eliot had been wrapped in warmth, given broth and rest, but his mind never settled. The betrayal of the fire still pulsed through him like a wound that refused to close. Mr. Carter stayed near, speaking little, his steady presence anchoring the boy who had been left adrift. It was Carter who insisted the truth must not be hidden. The group of scouts who witnessed the discovery stood ready to speak if needed, but it was Carter's determination that carried Eliot back toward the town where the lies waited. In a low-lit motel off the highway, Eliot's father was rehearsing his sorrow. He sat at the edge of a bed covered in cheap floral sheets, face buried in his hands. A bottle of whiskey rested by the nightstand, the picture of a man consumed by grief. To any outsider, he looked like a father hollowed by tragedy. The plan was simple. He would tell the police his son had strayed into the forest and vanished. He would speak of his own despair, and perhaps even summon tears, before pointing to the inheritance that would one day be his alone. But the door opened before his story could take form. Eliot stepped inside, thin but unbroken, his frame outlined by the dull light of the hallway. Behind him came Carter, tall and composed, and the scouts who had carried fragments of the truth in their young eyes. The father froze, the rehearsed anguish evaporating, replaced by a colorless shock that drained him to stone. "You," his voice faltered. He had expected silence, not the living presence of the boy he thought erased. Eliot did not speak. He did not need to. His very survival dismantled the lie. Carter moved forward, his expression measured. He placed a recorder on the small table, its red light blinking. The confession Eliot had whispered at the ranger station now lived in permanent memory. Words that revealed abandonment as deliberate, not accidental. Every detail of the plan was preserved, impossible to twist or bury. The scouts had corroborated it, and the ranger himself had already filed a report. There would be no retreat from the truth. The father tried to rise, words spilling from him in uneven gasps. He claimed misunderstanding, insisted the boy had panicked and run, that he had searched but could not find him. Yet his face betrayed him, his lies cracked beneath the weight of witnesses. Carter did not argue. He only turned toward the officers summoned to the room and handed them the evidence. Handcuffs replaced the father's grip on whiskey, the cold steel closing around wrists that once held authority over Eliot's life. He shouted still, the words of a desperate man clinging to a crumbling mask, but the sound carried no power. Eliot watched, silent, his fingers pressed once more against the small rainbow pin at his chest. This was not victory born of vengeance. It was survival finding justice. The officers led the man away, the door shutting on the hollow echoes of his resistance. The motel fell quiet. Eliot stood there, no longer trembling. In his silence lived something larger than anger. It was the recognition that lies, no matter how carefully rehearsed, cannot bury the truth forever. As Carter placed a steady hand on his shoulder, Eliot learned another lesson etched by the weight of experience. Justice may move slowly, but it comes when courage refuses to vanish. A father's attempt to rewrite his son's existence had ended where all deceit eventually does in the light. The courthouse smelled of polished oak and paper, its walls lined with portraits of judges long past. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, sharp and unforgiving, illuminating every face inside. Eliot sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his small frame dwarfed by the weight of the proceedings. Yet the boy who had once trembled in the forest now carried himself with a composure born not from years, but from what he had endured. The rainbow pin gleamed against his jacket, not hidden anymore but worn openly, a silent declaration of who he was. Across the room, his father avoided his eyes. The man who had once stood as protector now sat shackled, his face hardened by bitterness. The charges were read aloud: attempted filicide, child endangerment, and insurance fraud. Each word echoed like a hammer striking an anvil, building a chain that tightened around him. The courtroom stirred with disbelief as the prosecutor detailed how a parent had abandoned his own son in the Alaskan wild to secure control of insurance money and the remnants of a family estate. It was not only cruelty, but calculation, and it shocked even the most seasoned observers. Eliot listened, his breath steady, each detail confirming what he had survived. The scouts testified, their young voices clear as they described finding him collapsed by the stream. Carter spoke next, his presence filling the room with an authority that came not from uniform, but from truth. He played the recording, Eliot's broken voice recounting the betrayal by the campfire. No one moved as the boy's words filled the chamber. When the last sentence fell, silence reigned, heavy and undeniable. The defense tried to paint it differently, arguing confusion, claiming miscommunication. But the lies collapsed against the weight of evidence. The gavel struck, and judgment was rendered. Guilty, the man who had cast his son to the wild would now spend his years behind bars, not as a patriarch in control, but as a prisoner stripped of power. Then came the moment no one had foreseen. A lawyer stood, papers in hand, and announced that he represented Eliot's late mother. From her, there was a final act of love, sealed in ink before her death. Her will revealed a new provision. The family store and assets were not to pass to her husband, but directly to Eliot. More than wealth, it was a charge. The inheritance came with a condition that it be used to establish a scholarship for LGBT youth abandoned by their families. Her words, read aloud in the solemn chamber, transformed grief into purpose. Eliot lowered his head, tears slipping freely. But they were no longer the tears of a boy left to die. They were the tears of someone who had been chosen, not discarded. He rose, meeting Carter's eyes across the room. Without hesitation, he walked into his guardian's embrace. Carter, once a stranger, was now more than a savior. He would become Eliot's legal guardian, a protector not by blood, but by choice, bound by the shared truth of survival and identity. The cameras outside the courthouse captured the image of a boy who had walked through betrayal and returned not as a victim, but as a voice for the public. It was a story of cruelty exposed and justice served. For Eliot, it was the beginning of something greater, a mission to turn his own pain into the salvation of others who might one day find themselves cast aside. The lesson lingered in the air as he left the steps of the courthouse. Survival was never meant to be silent. It was meant to be shared, to remind the world that even those pushed into the cold can rise with fire. Eliot had been left in the wilderness to vanish, yet he returned carrying the legacy of a mother's love and the promise of a future where no child would face the same darkness alone. Sometimes those who wish to bury you become the very reason you find the strength to stand taller than ever before. Eliot had not only survived the forest, he had inherited a destiny to protect others. Do you believe family is defined by blood, or by those who choose to stand with us when the world turns away? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories for more stories that remind us why survival, justice, and love matter most.